Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to one of the darkest and most misunderstood chapters in early American history, the Salem witch trials. You've probably heard the story. Innocent villagers accused of witchcraft, trials filled with hysteria, and people hanged on gallows under a pale New England sky. But what if the truth was far more complicated and far more ordinary than the ghost stories we grew up with? In this quiet journey through the past, we'll explore what really happened in Salem between 1692 and 1693. How fear, faith, and frustration turned a small Puritan town into a symbol of madness. We'll trace where it all began with a few strange fits inside a minister's house, and follow the slow, chilling unraveling of a community that lost its sense of reason. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? The year was 1692, and winter held the Massachusetts Bay Colony in its icy grip. Salem Village, a farming settlement just outside the busier Salem town, was small, devout, and tense. Families argued over land boundaries. Ministers complained about unpaid salaries. Crops had failed the year before. Disease lingered. Everything felt fragile, and people whispered that God was angry. At the center of this uneasy little world was Reverend Samuel Parris, a rigid and unpopular preacher who had once worked as a merchant in the Caribbean. His sermons thundered with warnings about sin and Satan's power, but his real troubles came from home, from the strange behavior of his own daughter, Betty Parris, age 9, and his niece, Abigail Williams, age 11. In January of that year, the two girls began to twist, scream, and fall into fits that no one could explain. They claimed invisible hands pinched them, and that voices whispered their names at night. The village doctor, unable to find a medical reason, gave the only explanation a Puritan mind could accept: the devil was at work. Once the doctor said those words, fear spread like wildfire. Other girls in Salem Village began showing the same symptoms: convulsions, screaming, strange trances. They pointed trembling fingers at people they claimed had bewitched them. At first, the accused were women who lived on the edge of society. Women like Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved servant from Barbados, Sarah Good, a destitute beggar, and Sarah Osborne, who had skipped church for months due to illness. Tituba's role would become legendary. When questioned, she first denied the accusations, but under pressure, she confessed. She spoke of black dogs, yellow birds, and the devil's book in which witches signed their names. Whether she was trying to save herself or simply repeating what she thought the Puritans wanted to hear, her confession confirmed the villagers' worst fears. To them, this was proof that Satan had indeed come to Salem. From there, paranoia gripped the village. Ordinary arguments over fences, livestock, or gossip turned deadly. If someone's cow died, or bread wouldn't rise, or a child fell sick, it wasn't bad luck anymore. It was witchcraft. The courtrooms filled with trembling witnesses and afflicted girls collapsing dramatically in front of the accused. Judges took their screams as evidence, and each accusation led to another and another, until the entire community seemed to be falling apart. The trials themselves were held under a newly established court called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which literally means to hear and determine. Presiding over it was Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man known for his unshakable belief in the devil's presence. Evidence didn't have to be physical. Spectral evidence, visions, dreams, and unseen spirits was enough to condemn a person. You could be executed because someone dreamed you had hurt them. Over the spring and summer of 1692, the madness grew. 19 people were hanged. One man was crushed to death under heavy stones, and more than 150 others were jailed. Fields went untended, families starved, and churches turned silent. The ministers prayed louder, but God seemed to look away. Salem had become its own kind of hell, one built not by witches, but by fear itself. By autumn, the fever began to fade. Prominent citizens started to doubt. Ministers from neighboring towns urged restraint. And when the governor's own wife was accused of witchcraft, everything changed. Suddenly, the colony realized the madness had gone too far. The trials were suspended, prisoners were released, and spectral evidence was finally rejected as nonsense. But for those who had died, and those who lived with the guilt, the damage was beyond repair. Salem would spend years trying to forget or to make sense of what had happened. The official apologies came decades later, but the shame lingered like smoke from a long-dead fire. The witch trials became a lesson in what happens when fear outweighs reason, when belief is stronger than truth. And yet, the deeper question remains: why did this hysteria begin in the first place? Was it really about witchcraft, or something much older, hidden beneath the surface of society itself? The seeds of Salem's tragedy had been planted long before the first witch was accused. By 1692, New England was not the peaceful, pious world its settlers had once dreamed of. It was a place haunted by war, famine, and the unknown wilderness beyond its borders. The people of Salem lived on a frontier, not just against nature, but against their own fears. Every whisper of the forest wind seemed to carry both danger and temptation. One major source of anxiety was King William's War, a brutal conflict between England and France that raged through the colonies from 1688 to 1697. Many of the villagers in Salem had fled from towns in Maine that were destroyed by French and Native American attacks. They carried with them not only trauma, but stories of invisible enemies and dark magic. To a Puritan mind, war itself was often seen as a punishment from God, a sign that Satan was active in the world. Then came the division within Salem itself. Though it looked like one community, it was actually split in two: Salem Village and Salem Town. The village was rural, isolated, and poor. The town was coastal, wealthy, and tied to trade. The villagers wanted independence, their own church, their own leadership, while the townspeople preferred control. These simmering tensions between the rich and the poor, the old and the new, created a perfect breeding ground for suspicion. Reverend Samuel Parris became a symbol of that divide. Many villagers had supported him as their minister, but others saw him as greedy and self-righteous. He demanded deeds to the parsonage and payment in firewood, even as families struggled to survive. To his critics, Parris represented everything wrong with the village's leadership: pride disguised as holiness. And when the witchcraft panic began under his roof, those resentments turned spiritual. Religion ruled every aspect of Puritan life. They believed that humans were born sinful, that salvation was rare, and that Satan was constantly hunting for souls. Illness, drought, or failed crops weren't random. They were divine messages. So when children began to convulse or scream at night, it wasn't viewed as sickness. It was proof that evil had slipped past their prayers. This fear wasn't new. It was centuries old, stretching back to medieval Europe. But in Salem, it found new life. And yet the afflicted girls, Betty, Abigail, and the others, were not villains. Many were young, frightened, and trapped in a world where they had no power. In Puritan society, children were expected to be silent and obedient. But when the fits began, suddenly the most powerless members of society were being listened to, even feared. Whether their symptoms came from trauma, boredom, or genuine belief, their cries gave them a strange kind of authority they had never known before. Some historians even suggest that the witchcraft hysteria might have had a physical cause. In the 1970s, researchers proposed that the villagers could have been poisoned by a fungus called ergot, which grows on rye and produces effects similar to LSD hallucinations, convulsions, and paranoia. The theory remains debated, but it offers a haunting possibility. Maybe the devil the villagers feared wasn't supernatural at all. Maybe it was in their bread. Beyond disease and war, Salem was suffocating under the weight of isolation. The colony had strict rules about behavior, clothing, and even thought. Music and dancing were frowned upon. Books other than the Bible were rare. The harsh winters meant months of confinement indoors, where gossip and grudges festered. It was a pressure cooker of human emotion, sealed tight by fear of sin. When something finally broke, it exploded in the only language they understood: accusations of witchcraft. And there was one more ingredient in this toxic mixture: gender. Most of the accused were women, particularly those who were poor, outspoken, or lived outside traditional roles. Widows, beggars, midwives, anyone who seemed too independent became a target. Puritan society believed that women were spiritually weaker, more susceptible to the devil's whispers. So, when chaos needed a face, it was often a woman. The witch trials weren't just a moment of madness. They were a mirror reflecting the deep cracks in a society obsessed with control. Fear became a tool to enforce order. Guilt became a weapon. And belief in the devil became a convenient way to explain away every hardship and every injustice. In a strange way, Salem's witch hunts were less about witches and more about human nature itself. By the end of that dreadful year, as the hangings continued and the jails filled, the same people who had once cheered the trials began to question everything. How could a godly community commit such horrors in his name? The silence after the executions was deafening. The snow fell again over Salem's gallows hill, covering the footprints of the living and the dead alike. The winter of 1692 was cruel in more ways than one. The cold settled deep into the bones of Salem village, and with it came a strange restlessness. Inside the Paris household, the nights grew longer, darker, and more haunted by the sound of muffled cries. Reverend Samuel Paris's daughter, Betty, and his niece, Abigail Williams, began to twist and scream, their small bodies jerking as if seized by invisible hands. They claimed to see spectral shapes moving through the room, pale figures, whispering voices, and cold touches in the dark. At first, the villagers thought it was illness. The midwives and physicians came with herbs and poultices, but nothing eased the girls' torment. Finally, Dr. William Griggs, the local doctor, declared the cause not natural but supernatural, a phrase that spread through the town like wildfire. In that instant, a medical mystery became a spiritual crisis. Fear turned to frenzy. It didn't take long before the girls began naming names. At first in whispers, then in trembling sobs, they accused 3 women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, of tormenting them. The choices were not random. Each woman stood on the margins of society. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean; Sarah Good, a destitute beggar; and Sarah Osborne, who defied church customs by living outside her husband's authority. The accusations reflected not only fear, but prejudice, class tension, and the hunger for a scapegoat. When the arrests began, Salem transformed almost overnight. The sound of chains clinking echoed through the frost-covered streets. Families watched in horror as constables dragged their neighbors away. The accused were taken to Salem jail, a dark, foul-smelling place where prisoners slept on straw and survived on moldy bread. For many, it was worse than death itself. The interrogations took place in the meeting house, under the flicker of candles and the gaze of the village elders. As the afflicted girls screamed and collapsed on the floor, judges and ministers shouted questions. Who torments you? How long have you served the devil? The accused, trembling, denied everything, but every protest seemed to confirm their guilt. In that courtroom, innocence had no language left to speak. Tituba's testimony changed everything. Under the pressure of threats and beatings, she confessed, not only admitting to witchcraft, but describing a vast conspiracy led by the devil himself. She told of a black man from Boston who made her sign his book, of talking animals, of witches flying on poles through the cold night sky. Whether her words were fear-born invention or deliberate self-preservation, they gave the Puritans exactly what they wanted: proof that Satan had infiltrated Salem. Her confession electrified the town. Suddenly, every ailment, every quarrel, every dead cow or spoiled crop found an explanation. Satan was real, and he was among them. Neighbors began to look at one another differently. Every sideways glance, every odd habit, every grudge became potential evidence. Suspicion became the only currency that mattered. The trials quickly gained momentum. By spring, new magistrates were appointed, and special courts were created to handle the growing flood of cases. The legal system itself began to collapse under the weight of hysteria. Instead of evidence, spectral testimony, claims that someone's spirit or shape had attacked, became admissible in court. It was a nightmare logic. Invisible crimes proved by invisible witnesses. By early summer, the gallows were ready. The first hanging took place on July 19, 1692. Bridget Bishop, a woman known for her colorful clothing and sharp tongue. She had been accused before, and now the old gossip returned to seal her fate. As she stood at the gallows, she maintained her innocence. But when the rope tightened and the crowd fell silent, few dared to speak against it. The fear of being next kept every mouth shut. After Bishop's death, there was no turning back. The trials became a self-feeding storm. More accusations, more arrests, more confessions, and each one confirmed the others. Families tore apart, churches split, and farms were abandoned. The villagers had unleashed something they could no longer control. Salem had become its own worst enemy, devouring itself in the name of purity. Even as summer deepened, the hangings continued. Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, and others followed Bishop to the noose. Some died praying, others cursed the judges. The youngest accused was only 5 years old. The devil, it seemed, had taken everyone, not by possession, but by panic. By autumn, the darkness in Salem was no longer metaphorical. The jails were overflowing, the crops had failed, and even the ministers began to whisper doubts. But the machine of accusation kept grinding on. Those who confessed and named others were spared. Those who stood by the truth were silenced forever. It was no longer about faith, it was survival. As summer turned to autumn in 1692, Salem village no longer resembled the godly Puritan settlement, but a place caught between fever and faith. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of sweat, candle wax, and terror. The gallows at Gallows Hill became a dreadful landmark, visible from the fields, a constant reminder of divine punishment, or human cruelty, depending on who you asked. The wind that carried the smell of turned earth now carried the memory of death. Each hanging was treated like a public sermon. The villagers would gather, whispering psalms under their breath, convinced they were watching God's justice unfold. But for many, doubt had already begun to grow. Some noticed that the afflicted girls seemed to faint only when important people entered the courtroom. Others whispered that the judges enjoyed the power too much, that this was no longer about the devil, but about control. Still, the machinery of accusation did not stop. By late August, the trials had spread far beyond Salem village to Andover, Ipswich, and Gloucester. Panic had become portable. The afflicted children, now local celebrities, were escorted to each new town like grim prophets. They pointed, screamed, and named new witches. Their word carried the weight of divine testimony. To question them was to question God. Inside the jails, the scene was almost indescribable. Chains clinked against stone. The air stank of sickness, rot, and despair. Some prisoners prayed. Others sang hymns until their voices cracked. Families sold land, furniture, and livestock to pay for food or bribes to keep loved ones alive. Children were born in chains. A few prisoners carved verses into the walls with nails or stones, leaving behind fragments of faith scratched into the dark. In the midst of this horror, one man, Giles Corey, refused to play the game. When accused of witchcraft, he would not plead guilty or innocent, knowing that a plea would allow the court to seize his land. The judges ordered the ancient punishment for silence, pressing. Giles was laid on the ground, a board placed upon his chest, and heavy stones stacked until his ribs cracked. For 2 days he endured it. Each time the sheriff demanded a confession, Corey gasped only 2 words, more weight. His death shocked even the most pious citizens. For the first time, the righteousness of the trials began to look like vengeance. Ministers argued in hushed tones. Some wondered if the devil's real victory was not through witches, but through the town's own cruelty. Yet still, the hangings continued. Fear had become a kind of faith, and Salem was too deep in the fire to step out. Meanwhile, those who confessed often did so under unbearable pressure. The jailers promised mercy in exchange for names, and so names poured forth, each confession igniting a new round of arrests. The courts called it proof. The villagers called it justice. But beneath it all, a quiet madness had taken root. a belief that purity could be achieved only through endless punishment. By September, 19 people had been hanged, one pressed to death, and several more had died in prison. Salem's graveyards swelled with unmarked mounds. Yet the afflicted children still twitched, screamed, and pointed fingers. To stop now would be to admit the possibility of error, and in Puritan eyes, error was sin. It was better to continue killing than to confess to having killed wrongly. Even the judges began to tremble under the weight of what they'd created. Judge Samuel Sewall recorded sleepless nights in his diary, writing that the court hath much blood upon it. The ministers, too, began to doubt spectral evidence, the very backbone of the trials. But to overturn it meant undoing months of divine justice. Their theology offered no clean escape. Outside the courtrooms, fields lay untended, harvests spoiled, and livestock starved. The community had turned inward, afraid of neighbors, afraid of family, afraid of itself. The Puritan dream of a perfect, godly society was rotting from within. And as the last leaves of 1692 began to fall, Salem was left with little more than hunger, guilt, and the fading echo of its own prayers. By the chill of late autumn in 1692, the flames of panic that had once consumed Salem began to flicker. The trials that had started as divine crusades now felt more like an infection eating through the village's soul. The streets were emptier, the churches quieter. People no longer shouted about witches. They whispered about mistakes. Mothers who once condemned their neighbors now wept for their own lost children. And in those whispers, the first cracks began to show. A turning point came when Governor William Phips returned from the frontier wars. He found his colony gripped by madness. Dozens still waited in crowded jails, and his own wife had been accused of witchcraft. Shocked by what he saw, Phips ordered an end to the court of Owyre and Terminer, the special tribunal that had condemned so many. The same government that once demanded confessions now began quietly releasing prisoners. For the first time, silence settled over the gallows. The executions stopped. The ropes were cut, the bodies buried, and the air filled with the uneasy quiet of a village that didn't know what to believe anymore. No sermons were preached to celebrate these events. The ministers had grown cautious, their words heavy with doubt. The sound of hammers repairing homes replaced the sound of prayer meetings. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when people begin counting their dead. Still, the damage was done. Families of the condemned were left destitute. Their lands had been seized, their names blackened beyond repair. Widows begged for food. Orphans were sent away to distant relatives. Graves remained unmarked, as if to bury the shame alongside the dead. Salem, once a proud Puritan stronghold, was now a haunted place, haunted not by witches, but by memory. In January of 1693, the final trials began under a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature. Chief Justice William Stoughton, who had led the earlier hangings, still presided, but now something had changed. The court refused to accept spectral evidence, the invisible testimony that had once convicted so many. Without it, the accusations crumbled. Of the 56 people tried, only 3 were convicted, and even those were soon pardoned. The witch panic had burned itself out. But while the court turned away from hysteria, the church could not so easily escape its guilt. Reverend Samuel Parris, The very man whose sermons had ignited the first sparks now found himself despised. His congregation dwindled. His words no longer held weight. People began to walk out midst. He begged for forgiveness, but his apologies came too late. In time, Paris would leave Salem in disgrace, his legacy forever tied to the blood of the innocent. Meanwhile, one of the judges, Samuel Sewall, became the first to publicly repent. In 1697, standing before his congregation, he confessed his guilt and asked God's mercy for the lives he had helped destroy. The church bells tolled as he bowed his head in front of the same people who once praised him. It was an act unheard of among the Puritans, an open admission that faith had been twisted by fear. That same year, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and prayer, not for deliverance from witches, but for repentance. The colony prayed for forgiveness for its errors and ignorance. Yet the families of the condemned found little comfort in words. Their loved ones were still gone, their graves still bare. For them, no sermon could wash away the memory of the hangings. Over the next decades, Salem slowly faded from view. The village merged with nearby towns. Its infamous name became something to whisper, not speak aloud. Yet the story of the witch trials never truly died. It became a warning, passed down through generations, a reminder of how easily fear can masquerade as faith, and how the purest intentions can curdle into cruelty when belief blinds reason. By the time the last surviving participants of the trials had grown old, even they struggled to explain what had happened. How had good men and women turned against one another? How had prayer become a weapon? The answer, perhaps, lay not in witchcraft, but in the very human fear of losing control, a fear that still lingers in every age, dressed in new names, repeating the same old story. Winter came early that year. The winds off the Massachusetts coast were sharp and unkind, slicing through the thin walls of homes still scarred by grief. In the nights that followed the final executions, the people of Salem barely spoke above a whisper. Doors creaked open to reveal families gathered in silence, their candlelight trembling as though the flame itself feared to be seen. Those who once filled the meeting house with cries for justice now sat huddled by their fires, listening to the emptiness left behind. The prisons that had overflowed with the accused were now hollow shells, their straw beds cold and damp. Many who had survived captivity emerged as shadows of their former selves, thin, pale, haunted. Some had spent months chained to stone floors, surviving only on crusts of bread and rainwater. When they finally stumbled home, they found their farms sold, their families scattered, and their reputations beyond repair. Freedom, for them, was only another kind of punishment. And still, the whispers of witchcraft did not vanish overnight. Fear clung to Salem like frost on the eaves. Even those who doubted the trials dared not say so aloud. A few stubborn villagers clung to the belief that evil truly had stalked their town, that the hangings were a divine necessity. But for others, those who had watched loved ones perish, the only evil they recognized now was their own blindness. The weight of guilt began to settle, heavier than any curse. By early 1693, Governor Phipps was flooded with petitions from desperate families begging for pardons. Husbands wrote trembling letters asking for their wives' release. Children scrawled shaky signatures pleading for their mothers. The governor, perhaps hoping to salvage his colony's fractured soul, began granting clemency in batches. Each pardon felt like a drop of rain in a drought too late to heal, but enough to keep hope from dying altogether. Meanwhile, whispers began to turn toward the accusers. What had once been seen as holy visions were now regarded with suspicion. People began to question the trembling girls who had started it: Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam, Mercy Lewis. Names, once spoken with awe, now carried a bitter taste. Some claimed they were liars. Others believed they had been victims themselves, trapped in a hysteria beyond their understanding. But no one truly knew what to do with them. Salem no longer wanted witches, but neither did it want reminders. Ann Putnam Jr., only 12 when the trials began, would live long enough to feel the full weight of her actions. Years later, she stood before the same congregation where she once wept and screamed of witches and devils. Her voice was quiet this time, trembling not with visions, but with regret. She confessed that she had been deceived by fear, by others, perhaps by herself. It was one of the few true apologies ever spoken in Salem. But apologies could not erase the horror. Entire families had been torn apart. The Nurse family, who had lost the gentle Rebecca Nurse to the gallows, became a symbol of endurance. Her children built a small monument in secret, marking her name where her body had fallen. Each spring they would lay wildflowers at the site. That act, simple and quiet, was the first step. Across Massachusetts, ministers and magistrates began to distance themselves from the trials. Some rewrote sermons, others burned their old notes. Even Cotton Mather, once a fierce defender of the witch hunt, softened his tone, though never admitting outright fault. In Boston, intellectuals whispered that the trials had embarrassed the colony before God and the world. It was an unspoken truth. Salem had become a cautionary tale, not a victory of faith. The public began to crave answers. How had this happened? How had so many intelligent, pious people become tools of such cruelty? In taverns and marketplaces, people traded rumors about the trials, some blaming envy, others greed, and others still the devil himself. But the real answer was simpler and far more human. Fear had made them believe anything, and belief, once set loose, needs no proof to destroy lives. A few of the accused refused to return to Salem at all. They left for neighboring towns: Danvers, Beverly, Marblehead, trying to start new lives under false names. But wherever they went, the past followed. People would whisper when they entered a room. Children stared. Some became recluses. Others found solace in prayer. But all carried the same wound. They had been branded by hysteria, and the mark could never fully fade. Years passed, and the gallows hill began to erode. Grass grew where the condemned had stood, and the wind carried away the cries of the crowd. Yet, even as time softened the edges of memory, the fear lingered in the soil. It lived on in stories told by parents to their children, warnings about devils, women, and disobedience. The people had learned to be afraid all over again, only this time of themselves. By 1700, the last echoes of the trials had become ghosts in conversations, something spoken of in low voices, as if saying too much might summon the madness again. But in the hearts of those who remembered, the guilt never truly faded. It would take generations before anyone dared to tell the story openly. And when they did, they told it not as a tale of witches, but as a warning about what happens when a community forgets its humanity. As the years moved forward, silence became Salem's most faithful companion. What had once been a roaring storm of accusation had faded into a thick, uneasy quiet. In that quiet, people began to really think, for the first time in years. Husbands who had watched their wives swing from the gallows now lay awake at night, staring into the fire, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. Mothers clutched their children closer, terrified of the thought that a single dream, a single word, could destroy another life. Some of the jurors who had condemned the accused began to crumble under the weight of their own decisions. Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent judges, was among the first to break. In 1697, during a solemn day of prayer and fasting, he stood before the congregation in Boston and confessed his guilt. He bowed his head and asked for forgiveness, not just from God, but from the ghosts of those who had been wrongly put to death. The congregation fell silent. It was the first public crack in the armor of righteousness that had once protected the trials. Not everyone, however, found redemption so easily. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, who had presided over many of the executions, refused to admit any error. He defended his judgments until his death, insisting that the devil had truly walked among them. His stubbornness became a bitter symbol of Preda, reminder that while guilt can soften hearts, arrogance can petrify them forever. His home stood large and grim, a silent monument to the unrepentant. By now, the colony itself had changed. The economic toll of the trials was devastating. Fields had gone untended, while farmers were jailed or executed. Trade slowed as outsiders avoided Salem, calling it cursed. The once busy harbor grew quieter, ships docking elsewhere. In a cruel twist of irony, the town that had condemned others for consorting with the devil was now seen as a place touched by evil. Even religion, the foundation of their world, had begun to shift. Ministers who once preached of fire and brimstone began speaking of mercy and restraint. The younger generation of Puritans listened quietly, unsure whether to cling to the old fear or reach toward forgiveness. Some began to question the very idea of spectral evidence, visions, and dreams used as proof in court. Slowly, the line between faith and fanaticism began to sharpen. In the years that followed, a strange transformation overtook Salem village. The people avoided the word witch altogether. It was as if naming it might reawaken the ghosts of 1692. Instead, they spoke of the dark year, or simply the trouble. Parents warned their children not to ask questions, and those who had lost family members spoke only in whispers. Forgetting became its own form of survival. But history has a cruel habit of resisting silence. In nearby towns like Danvers and Beverly, gossip thrived. Travelers told and retold the story of Salem's madness, each time adding their own flavor: more witches, more demons, more drama. Within a decade, the story had already begun to twist into legend. The truth became tangled in superstition, and Salem's shame became everyone else's fascination. The families of the accused tried desperately to reclaim their names. They filed petitions, demanded compensation, and begged the courts to clear their loved ones' reputations. Some succeeded years later. Others never did. Money was granted, but grief has no ledger. The loss of trust, the feeling that neighbors could turn against one another overnight, was a wound that gold could never close. By the early 18th century, Salem had split into two distinct towns, Salem Town and Salem Village, now Danvers. It was more than a geographic divide. It was a spiritual one. Salem Town moved toward commerce and trade, seeking prosperity to wash away the past. Salem Village, however, remained rural and reserved, its people still clinging to their haunted soil. The two places shared a name, but not a heart. The descendants of those executed lived in quiet bitterness. Some of them left Salem entirely, heading toward Boston or farther west, hoping to start anew. Yet, no matter how far they went, the stigma followed. The label which hung like smoke in the Aaron accusation that never truly died. Their grandchildren would still hear whispers in church pews or at market stalls that one's blood is cursed. For others, the memory of 1692 became a warning passed down through generations. Parents told their children to be careful with rumors, to think before speaking ill of others. Teachers, when reading from the Bible, lingered on verses about false witness. In a strange way, the witch trials had taught Salem something its faith had not: the danger of absolute certainty. A few decades later, historians and ministers began writing about the events in pamphlets and diaries, trying to make sense of what had happened. Some blamed politics, the instability of a young colony. Others blamed the strict religion, or even poisoned grain that might have caused hallucinations. But deep down, everyone knew the truth was simpler. The fear of the unknown had consumed them all. As time went on, Salem became a symbol, a moral story told across the colonies. Preachers used it to warn of pride. Writers used it to describe the fragility of reason. By the 1800s, long after the Puritans were gone, poets and philosophers would look back on Salem as the perfect metaphor for hysteria. The very name Salem would forever carry a strange weight, half tragedy, half cautionary tale. And yet, beneath all the guilt and history, the land itself remained eerily beautiful. The forests that once echoed with cries, of which now whispered only with the wind. Moss crept over the stones of the old meeting house, and wildflowers grew where the gallows had once cast their shadow. Nature, it seemed, had forgiven what people could not. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Salem witch trials had become more than a memory. They had become a mirror that showed not witches or devils, but the terrifying potential of human fear. In 1692, it had taken only a few frightened girls and a handful of ministers to plunge an entire community into madness. The lesson of Salem would echo through every dark chapter of American history that followed. When the trials ended, Massachusetts was forced to reconsider its laws. The reliance on spectral evidence, testimony of dreams and invisible spirits, was abolished. Courts began demanding physical proof for crimes, a shift that laid the groundwork for the modern American justice system. Salem's hysteria, born from superstition, ironically, gave birth to reason. Yet, not all lessons were legal. The deeper transformation happened within hearts and minds. For decades, people spoke less of witches and more of guilt. Families carried that guilt like heirlooms, passing it quietly from one generation to the next. It softened New England's sharp edges. Sermons that once thundered with fire now trembled with humility. The people of Massachusetts learned painfully that faith without compassion could destroy a soul faster than any devil. By the time America began inching toward independence, Salem had already become a moral warning. Ministers used it to preach against mob rule. Lawyers cited it as proof that justice must never bow to emotion. And philosophers, watching revolutions unfold in Europe, invoked Salem as a reminder of what happens when ideology blinds humanity. Salem had become a ghost story for the Enlightenment, a tale of fear conquering reason. In the 19th century, Salem found its way into literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose ancestor had been one of the trial judges, could never escape that shadow. His novels, The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables, are soaked with the guilt of Puritanism. Through his words, the witch trials lived again, not as history, but as metaphor, the weight of inherited sin, the danger of judgment, the quiet suffering of conscience. By then, Salem had become a pilgrimage site. Tourists arrived in carriages, later in trains, eager to stand where the accused once stood. Locals began retelling the events with new theatrical flair, turning sorrow into spectacle. Some built museums, others sold souvenirs. The witch trials had become an American legend, both a warning and an attraction. The soil that had once soaked in fear now yielded profit. Still, amid all the commercial gloss, the tragedy remained deeply human. Every October, as autumn fog rolled across the Massachusetts coast, descendants of the accused would visit old cemeteries. They left flowers on stones carved with names like Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Good. The wind that brushed through those graveyards carried a sense of unfinished peace, a whisper of apology centuries late. In time, the United States would face new kinds of witch hunts. During the Red Scare of the 1950s, Senator Joseph McCarthy accused Americans of communism with the same blind certainty that once condemned witches. Writers like Arthur Miller drew direct parallels. His play, The Crucible, turned 1692 into a timeless allegory of fear, politics, and mass hysteria. Salem had risen again, not as a ghost, but as a warning that history loves repetition. Today, the story of Salem is taught in schools across the world, not for its horror, but for its humanity. It reminds us that ordinary people, in times of uncertainty, are capable of extraordinary cruelty. But it also reminds us that repentance is possible, that reason can rise from ruin. Salem's truest legacy is not witches or superstitions. Walking through modern Salem feels strange. The cobblestones remain, but the air is lighter. Cafes and bookstores line the old streets where gallows once loomed. Street performers dressed as witches pose for photographs. The same town that once executed people for witchcraft now celebrates the very image of it. It's ironic, almost poetic. The town has taken back its story, rewritten it with laughter instead of screams. And yet, when night falls and the tourists leave, Salem returns to stillness. The old meeting house, the cemetery, the whispering trees, they all remain as silent witnesses to the fragility of human belief. Beneath the streetlights, if you listen closely, you might imagine the echoes of prayers, confessions, or perhaps the faint cry of someone falsely accused. The ghosts of 1692 don't haunt Salem out of vengeance. They linger as reminders. The Salem witch trials were not a story of witches, but of people, of fear, of ignorance, of faith turned inside out. They remind us that the line between righteousness and ruin is painfully thin. History may move forward, but its lessons remain waiting, patient for the moment humanity forgets again. As the 18th century unfolded, the memory of Salem lingered in whispered stories and local folklore. Children grew up hearing tales of women who had spoken to unseen spirits, of courtrooms filled with trembling voices, of ministers who swore they saw the devil's shadow. Yet, over time, fear softened into curiosity. The same stories that once paralyzed a community began to teach it, showing future generations how belief, when left unchecked, can bend reality itself. The legal reforms that followed were quiet. Colonial governors began placing stricter limits on court testimony, demanding evidence that could be seen, touched, or measured. The reliance on dreams, spectral sightings, and hearsay began to fade from American jurisprudence. What had begun as tragedy became the seed of rational law legacy that can still be traced in the U.S. Constitution's insistence on fair trials and due process. The ministers who once thundered from their pulpits now spoke with a quieter voice. Many turned their sermons inward, questioning not the devil's influence, but their own. A kind of spiritual humility took root across New England, the recognition that purity without mercy can become a form of cruelty. The Puritan fire dimmed into something gentler, more introspective. Faith, chastened by its own mistakes, began to seek grace over judgment. In small wooden meeting houses, entire congregations confessed regret. Some even publicly apologized for what their forefathers had done. The witch trials, once justified as holy defense, were now seen as moral failure. That collective remorse became part of America's spiritual DNA, a reminder that righteousness without empathy leads only to ruin. For the descendants of the accused, Salem's shadow never fully lifted. Families like the Nurses and the Goods lived with a strange dual inheritance, pain and pride. Pain for what their ancestors endured, pride because those same ancestors had faced death with dignity. Centuries later, their name still carried quiet strength. Rebecca Nurse's home became a symbol of endurance, a place where history could speak softly instead of scream. By the early 1800s, writers and historians began to revisit Salem, not as superstition, but as literature. Washington, Irving, and Nathaniel Hawthorne both drew upon the Puritan world to explore guilt and redemption. The witch trials became an allegory, a language for inner conflict and moral struggle. Through fiction, America found a way to mourn, to interpret, and to reclaim what had once been unspeakable. As the Industrial Revolution transformed the young nation, Salem's old cobblestones became relics in a world chasing progress. Yet, even as factories rose and steam engines roared, the story of the trials remained a quiet counterpointer reminder that beneath all progress, superstition can still survive. The new America, though enlightened and modern, still carried the same human fragility that once burned witches in its squares. In the early 20th century, scholars began studying Salem through psychology and sociology. They saw not demons, but patterns, mass hysteria, groupthink, and the contagious nature of fear. For the first time, historians analyzed how isolation, religion, and politics intertwined to ignite panic. Salem became a case study for collective psychology, taught in universities and law schools as an example of moral collapse under pressure. By the 1950s, the story returned with political teeth. Arthur Miller's The Crucible struck a chord in Cold War America. where fear of communism mirrored the paranoia of 1692. Audiences recognized the pattern. Instantly different century, same hysteria. Salem had become eternal, a symbol that could be reborn whenever fear overpowered truth. Later generations took Salem and reshaped it once again. Feminist historians of the 1970s and 1980s reframed the witch trials as a story of whom is persecution, how outspoken, independent, or poor women became easy scapegoats in patriarchal societies. The witches of Salem became symbols of resilience, reclaiming the narrative from one of fear to one of empowerment. Even Hollywood found its way to Salem. From black and white dramas to modern horror films, each retelling twisted the story into something new. Sometimes the witches were villains, sometimes victims, and sometimes heroes misunderstood by their time. But beneath every version, the same heartbeat remained: the fragile line between belief and madness. Today, Salem's streets are a curious mix of the sacred and the playful. Tourists wander past haunted museums and candlelit ghost tours, yet local historians still guard the truth carefully. Each October, as the air turns sharp with autumn chill, the town becomes a living museum, a place where history breathes, teaching through irony. What once condemned has now become celebrated. But beyond the shops and performances lies something quieter. Beneath the laughter and the flicker of jack-o'-lanterns, you can still sense the weight of centuries. Walk alone through Gallows Hill at dusk, and the wind seems to whisper names: Sarah, Martha, Rebecca, Giles. They are not haunting, they are remembering. The land itself keeps the story, and perhaps that is Salem's truest gift to the world: remembrance. In a culture quick to forget, Salem insists that we pause. It invites reflection on justice, fear, and compassion, on how easily we can lose our humanity in the name of righteousness. Its ghosts do not ask for pity, they ask for awareness. Even now, when modern society faces new kinds of moral panics, from conspiracy theories to online outrage, the lesson of Salem stands unchanged. When fear governs thought, innocence becomes dangerous. When certainty silences doubt, truth disappears. Salem is not merely history, it's a mirror that reflects every age that dares to look. Long after the last stone had been laid on the graves at Salem, the ripples of that winter still spread outward. You could say that every courtroom, every public accusation, every headline that feeds on fear carries a faint echo of those 1692 whispers. The Salem witch trials were not an isolated madness. They became America's first great mirror, showing how fragile truth can be when fear begins to rule. Generations later, New Englanders found themselves drawn back to that dark chapter, not to relive it, but to understand it. Local historians began preserving the trial records, collecting yellowed testimonies, and mapping the sites of the old accusations. They treated each document not as evidence of evil, but as a fragile artifact of human frailty. Through their careful work, the victims' voices began to rise, again as warnings of witchcraft, but as proof of what blind conviction can do to ordinary lives. Even the geography of Salem changed meaning. Places that once bore only shame began to transform into sites of remembrance. Where once there had been gallows, now there were markers of grief. Where once stood fear, now stood understanding. It was as if the soil itself sought forgiveness, turning from cursed ground into a garden of memory. By the late 19th century, a new fascination took hold. Spiritualism swept through America, mediums, seances, and ghost photography, and Salem found itself reimagined, not as tragedy, but as threshold. People no longer feared witches. They wanted to speak to them. The line between history and imagination blurred once more, but this time without the cruelty. In a strange twist of fate, the very town that had executed witches became a sanctuary for those who believed in unseen worlds. Through the 20th century, artists and poets found inspiration in Salem's silence. They painted haunted forests and candlelit trials, wrote verses about women accused for dreaming too freely, and composed songs that mourned the loss of reason. Salem became not just a place, but a language, a way to talk about injustice without naming it. The witch trials also left their mark on how Americans understood gender. Historians began to notice a pattern. Most of the accused were women who did not conform, widows, midwives, healers, or simply women who spoke too much. Over time, that awareness evolved into a powerful symbol. The witch transformed from an image of evil into a voice of independence, quiet rebellion against the centuries of fear that tried to silence her. Even religion learned from Salem's scars. In the centuries that followed, American faith communities slowly opened their doors to compassion, emphasizing tolerance over punishment. The idea that doubt could coexist with belief became a hallmark of modern spirituality. Salem's lesson was clear. When religion becomes a weapon, faith itself begins to die. Legal scholars, too, drew from Salem's errors. By studying the transcripts, they learned how fear corrupts justice and how power bends truth. The concept of innocent until proven guilty began to carry deeper meaning, no longer a formality, but a safeguard against another Salem. The witch trials, in their silence, helped shape the conscience of modern law. Then came the museums, the small, candlelit rooms where history spoke softly through glass. Visitors could read the shaky handwriting of the condemned, see the pressed flowers left by their descendants, and feel the fragile boundary between past and present. These spaces became acts of restoration. Where once there had been terror, now there was tenderness. In the digital age, the story found new life. Online archives made the old court records accessible to anyone with curiosity and compassion. Suddenly, names like Elizabeth Proctor, Tituba, and Giles Corey were not distant shadows. They were searchable, readable, real. The internet, so often accused of spreading hysteria, had ironically become a way to heal one. Meanwhile, pop culture reshaped the witch once more, this time as a figure of mystery and power. From children's cartoons to fantasy novels, witches became symbols of freedom, knowledge, and rebellion against oppression. Salem's ghosts no longer hid, they danced, sang, and cast light on what was once feared. Yet beneath all these retellings, the original sorrow still hums quietly. No matter how many centuries pass, Salem remains a warning stitched into the fabric of American identity. The trials remind us that fear does not vanish, only changes its costume. Each generation must face its own witch hunt, its own test of reason against hysteria. Walk through Salem today, and you'll see two stories living side by side, one of tragedy and one of transformation. Tourists take photos by the witch statues, while locals place flowers near memorial stones. The laughter of school children mingles with the rustle of autumn leaves. The past no longer terrifies, it teaches. In the end, the legacy of Salem is not about witches at all. It's about people, ordinary, frightened, flawed people who stumbled in the dark and learned, too late, what light truly means. Their story is humanity's story, the battle between fear and reason, cruelty and compassion. That is why Salem endures. It is not a wound, it is a mirror that shows us who we've been and who we must never become again. And so, as the night deepens and the last candle flickers against your wall, we leave the cobbled streets of Salem behind. Imagine, for a moment, that quiet New England town under a blanket of mist. The trees whisper in the cool wind. The old wooden houses lean close together, as if still afraid of being overheard. Somewhere beneath the soil, the echoes of 1692 are still there, soft, restless, waiting for remembrance. No trials, no accusations, only the quiet hum of memory. What happened in Salem was not magic, not sorcery, but something far more human. It was fear disguised as faith. It was loneliness sharpened into suspicion. It was grief turned into a weapon. And yet, even in all that darkness, something survived, the small, stubborn flame of truth. Centuries later, that flame still burns in libraries, in classrooms, in the hearts of anyone who reads those fragile records and whispers, "This must never happen again." Because the witch trials of Salem were not truly about witches at all. They were about Usabo, how quickly we can lose sight of reason when the world feels uncertain. They were about what happens when imagination, unchecked by mercy, turns cruel. Tonight, perhaps, as you drift toward sleep, you can hear the echo of those old wooden footsteps fading down a dirt road. The world is quieter now, but the lesson remains. History's ghosts do not haunt to scare us. They haunt to remind us to be kind. So if you're still awake, take a breath. Let the past settle like dust in the lamplight. Salem's story is done for tonight and tomorrow. When the world feels strange again, you'll remember that even the darkest centuries eventually give way to morning. Good night. From the year 1692, sleep well.